in this section of our Risks and Trends Europe section, we'll be talking about how the European Union regulates the market, and specifically what benefits it derives from how it approaches market regulation. I am very excited to speak about these topics with our guest, Professor Anu Bradford, Professor of Law at Columbia University. Welcome. Who has written for me, one of the most interesting books of last year called The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World, published with Oxford University Press. So it's quite a big title, so let us start with unpacking what exactly it means. What is the Brussels effect, and what is it about the European Union that makes it possible? What specific features of how the European Union regulates the market? What is it about its institutions that make the Brussels effect possible?
Absolutely. So what do I mean by the Brussels effect? I think that is the question we should start with. So the Brussels effect refers to the European Union's unilateral ability to regulate the global marketplace. The EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world, and there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the European Union. So as the price for accessing the lucrative European markets, these companies need to comply with European regulations. But often they decide that it is in their interest to apply these regulations across their global production and across their global conduct, because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory regimes. So all the EU needs to do is to regulate the single market. It is then the business interests and the market forces that are driving the global companies to externalize these EU rules across the global markets.
Could you maybe give us some examples of the areas where this is possible? There are specific fields you look at in your book.
Yeah, so what to me makes the Brussels effect so interesting is that it really happens across a wide range of policy domains and industries. So if we start, for instance, of these big technology companies in the United States and focus on the digital economy, if you look at the privacy policies of big companies like Google or Facebook or Apple or Microsoft, these companies follow the European GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, across the world. If you also look at the rules that companies like Twitter and YouTube use when they decide what kind of speech they take down as hate speech, they don't follow American First Amendment that guarantees free speech. They look to the European definition of hate speech. And the examples are not just pertaining to American companies or the digital economy. The Brussels effect also impacts, and the EU law shapes how timber is harvested in Indonesia, what kind of pesticides Cameroonian cocoa farmers use, what kind of facilities Chinese dairy factories install in their factories, what kind of chemicals Japanese toy manufacturers use. So it is really a phenomenon that manifests itself in different industries and across different policy domains.
We often discuss about the European Union, how it's weak and how it doesn't have any external power, how even the soft law instruments it has are not very effective. But what you are describing as essentially is a wealth of evidence to the contrary, which shows that the European Union really does project its power across the world.
Yeah, indeed. So in many ways, my book is an invitation for us to consider what power means in today's world and what kind of influence really matters. So we're absolutely right if we concede that the EU is not a military power. It also has limited ability to govern the world through financial sanctions, for instance. But in many ways, regulatory power, it is very tangible. It is something that we don't always notice because it goes under the radar. It is not something that is traditionally associated with the hard power or even soft power. It falls somewhere in between. At the same time, it is the kind of power that is very influential in that it affects each and every one of us every day. It affects the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the products we produce and consume. And to me, that is really influence, and that is power.
But then the question comes, if these are the rules that we project across the world, then we inevitably end up thinking about who makes the rules and who benefits from these rules. It's quite easy to see that if there are regulations, they must generate winners and losers. Is this something that you look at as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a really interesting question of who benefits from the Brussels effect. And I would start by singling out probably the clearest winners. And if you think about European companies, they need to follow European rules. They are their own rules. But when they compete on export markets, the problem would be if they then are at disadvantage vis-a-vis foreign companies that would not be obliged to follow the same kind of rules. But if you take the Brussels effect seriously and believe that it is really shaping the regulatory environment even outside of the EU, it means that the EU can level the playing field and it can protect the competitiveness of the European industry that is now not at disadvantage because also the American companies are following the European rules when they are competing with EU companies in Brazil. So it is a big benefit for the European companies because they do not need to bear the cost of being the only ones that are complying. Also, obviously, European consumers, many of these rules, I would say that they really stem from being responsive to the European consumers' preferences, who care about sustainability, who care about protecting our climate, who care about food safety, the fundamental right to privacy, the competitive marketplace that lowers the prices for consumers and introduces more choice. So the consumers often in Europe are also happy to see that we export these sustainability norms in the global marketplace. It does help us protect the climate if it's not just in Europe where we see these efforts being taken. The more complicated question is how the foreign stakeholders experience these rules. And yes, I am quite willing to concede that there are, for instance, some foreign consumers who do not share the preferences of European consumers, who would rather pay less for a product than have a product that is more sustainable, who may not care about the personal right to privacy to the same extent. So yes, they are being served products and services that are conform to European preferences, so they could be perceived as losers. But at the same time, there are so many foreign consumers who actually welcome the Brussels effect as the way to offset the regulatory deficiencies of their own governments. Thanks to European Union, they do not have harmful chemicals pollute their rivers or endanger their personal health. They are grateful that somebody is looking after their personal privacy. And the foreign governments also fall a little bit in two camps. So there are some foreign governments who say that, look, the Brussels effect undermines our regulatory sovereignty. It is an assault on democracy because we no longer have the ability to decide what rules better work in our societies. We are bystanders when the EU regulates our markets. But there are also many foreign governments who, for instance, don't have the capacity to tackle global cartels and are quite happy that the EU's competition law is taking care of that and extending those preferences to them as well, who would like to protect the environment more, but don't have the capacity to go after big chemical companies and change their production patterns. So in that sense, there are both winners and losers, and it is not Europe versus the rest of the world. There are many stakeholders outside the EU that are big beneficiaries and big fans of the Brussels effect.
But what about inside the EU? Because you treat a little bit the industry as if it's has one homogeneous interest, and maybe the citizens also have heterogeneous preferences across the EU. So I just wondered when I was reading your book, if whose interests, or if you can't make the argument that it's particular part of the European economy that benefits from the Brussels effect more than others, or citizens of part of the European Union as opposed to others?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think you're very right to point out that often these regulations emanate from a rather contested regulatory process within the EU itself. So there are certain political parties, certain governments or consumer groups, for instance, who may not be as big fans, or certain companies that do not endorse all these rules to the same extent. But often what makes it interesting is that when there is contestation on the rules, for instance, on the international domain, often we see the lowest common denominator to prevail. But we see the opposite in the EU. So who is really getting the preferences translated into EU regulation often tends to be the pro-regulation states, that the stakeholders that are advocating more rather than less regulation. And the reason is that often these regulations first emanate from some member states. So the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, wasn't invented first in Brussels. Germany was one of the forerunners, France, Sweden, that went ahead with stringent privacy laws. Then the EU steps in when it realizes that the marketplace becomes fragmented and there's a problem if data cannot flow across the common European marketplace. So what the EU tends to do is, instead of asking Germany to back down and protect privacy less, telling France that you cannot protect privacy, it is elevating the other member states as well to the level that calls for more regulation. So in many ways, yes, there is contestation within the EU. Often the regulations that are relating to single market also get to the highest possible level of regulation, because we do not need every member state to agree. These are not subject to unanimity. So like with many European issues, there are compromises. There are member states whose first choice would not be this regulation. But ultimately, this is one of the benefits or costs of being part of the European Union.
So you can almost argue that we have qualified majority voting in some aspects of European foreign policy.
It's a very interesting way. Nobody has really put it that way. But if you consider, and that's another question, is the Brussels effect a foreign policy instrument? It certainly is an instrument that affects our foreign relations to a significant extent. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that it is actually a tool for geopolitics. But I like the framing and the invitation to think about it.
Okay. Now, so if it's really the expression of the interest to regulate a little bit more, what I found very interesting in your book as well is that you quite strongly argue that it's not protectionist, that the Brussels effect doesn't have this feature of being protectionist and isolating the European market, let's say. But with the Brexit in particular, now we have this trend or growing trend to talk about the European sovereignty, to use competition policy more for protectionist ends, so fostering European champions. Do you think that this trend, if you agree that it is there, do you think that it poses risks from the perspective of the efficacy of the Brussels effect?
So absolutely, I really appreciate the question. I think it's a big question and a very important question. So if we first look back to what the track record of the EU's regulation has been, there are those who perceive it as a manifestation of European protectionism. Especially in the United States, where I'm having my conversations, I often get asked, why is the EU going after these big American technology companies? Is it some envy-driven protectionist zeal where the EU is trying to level the opportunities for its less competitive tech companies? And there, I take quite strong view that what is not driving the EU regulation to date is protectionism. The EU is not going after Google because it is trying to protect some European search engine. There is no rival to Google in the EU to protect. If you also look at these big competition cases against American companies, often there's an American company on the other side of the dispute. So who brought the first complaint? to the Commission when the Commission started investigating Google. It was Microsoft. So often there are American companies on both sides of the disputes and not European companies that benefit if American companies, the practices are restricted. So in that sense, I think the protectionism up until today has been a rather false accusation of what the EU is doing. And the EU has not been, for instance, building national champions. The Commission was criticized by France and Germany for blocking the attempted rail merger between Siemens and Alstom that would have created a European champion that could have potentially competed then better against Chinese counterparts. That was the argument. The Commission refused to take that because the Commission saw that its mandate is to protect European consumers and not to create European champions. But I absolutely agree with you that we are seeing a change in the tone of the conversation. And we saw, for instance, France and Germany come up with this manifesto asking to reform the merger control policy and reshape the competition regulation in a way that it would allow for the creation of European champions. And I share your concern that now that the UK, that has been always more skeptical of regulation, a proponent of free markets, when the UK is not part of these conversations, there's more space for instance, French industrial policy inclinations to prevail. So there's certainly a danger of going down that path. And if you take the Brussels effect seriously, you should take this danger very seriously. Because if the EU has been successfully exporting its neutral competition rules, for instance, it certainly would be exporting its protectionist competition rules. And the European companies would face protectionist regulatory regimes in different parts of the world as well. So it would be very hard to contain the kind of industrial policy-driven regulation to the EU, given how influential the EU is in shaping the global regulatory environment.
So, but this is very interesting that because I would have thought that what would limit, let's say, the power of the Brussels effect in when it's being exported is that if it is perceived as being protectionist, if the European regulations are being perceived as protectionist, then this would discredit a little bit the force of European regulation, or also precisely this expertise, technical standards of the European regulations. But what you are pointing to is this ripple effect, where these protectionist regulations would then be replicated in different economies across the world.
Absolutely. So if you think about the Brussels effect, it happens on two levels. So we have mainly discussed how it shapes the practices of foreign companies operating on foreign markets, but it also shapes the practices and the regulatory choices of foreign governments. So if we think about, again, the GDPR, we talked how it has shaped the Microsofts, the Facebooks, and the Googles of the world. It also has led to a proliferation of GDPR type of regulations across the global marketplace. The same way the European competition law framework has been copied in tens and tens of regulatory jurisdictions around the world. And there's nothing that would prevent these countries, these governments, from looking to the EU and then observing, well, the EU seems to be using this instrument now towards protectionist end. That gives us the license to do the same.
Okay. And maybe a little bit about the institutional framework, turning to that specific question. So it's the European Commission that is the agent of Brussels effect to a big extent. It's especially when it comes to the nitty-gritty of the European regulations, when it comes to preparing the proposals, when it comes to enforcing competition law, the European Commission is in the lead. And what specific risks or maybe opportunities come from calling the European Commission more and more political, even geopolitical? Is that also a potential risk to the Brussels effect?
I would say that it can be. So now there is a change also in the conversation of, or this tendency to geopoliticize the whole conversation about regulation and trade and policy making. And I don't think that serves the Brussels effect well. The Brussels effect is not a geopolitical tool. It is a technocratic way of governing the EU that automatically can deploy the power of the markets to under the radar transfer the global marketplace. It has partially been so successful because it has been this kind of quiet technocratic power, because we haven't elevated these questions to the level of big political battles. And if we try to use this instrument towards geopolitical tools, I'm afraid we may lose some of that effectiveness that comes from this more quiet, more passive way of exerting influence.
And when it comes to the factors or conditions that make the Brussels effect possible, we discussed the institutions, so the role of the European Commission, but one thing that I wondered about was the rule of law, and if the rule of law is a question that is linked to the Brussels effect, and in what way? I mean, Brussels effect relies on the legal infrastructure.
Absolutely. So it is a story about the power of law. And in many ways, if you think about why the EU has been so successful, is that the quality of the legal framework that underlies it. So if you think about why global companies are ultimately comfortable using the Brussels rule as their global rule, is because they also perceive that it is a good quality, respected norm that they are comfortable telling their consumers, their customers, their shareholders, their employees to be their benchmark. It is also partially because of the respect for the quality of rulemaking, for the legitimacy of the legal process that underlies this, that has led many governments around the world to be comfortable then looking to the EU and telling their own constituencies, this works in the EU, it is perceived to be very good legislative framework, we are comfortable following that template. So in many ways, the idea that we take the rule of law seriously, we have a legal process, it does lead to a better quality legislation. And I would say that, again, if you take the Brussels effect seriously, it is particularly important because if the EU gets it right, it can get it globally right because the effects are global. But if your EU gets it wrong, it can get it globally wrong. And I would be very worried about the kind of legal framework governing the global marketplace that wasn't founded on a solid rule of law.
Then maybe we discussed how successful it is and how it relies on the technocratic foundations, but then isn't that proof that you need more democratic processes around it, more role for the voters, for the populations, for the citizens as well, as otherwise maybe you risk a populist backlash against technocracy as we've seen over the past decade. How do you...
Yeah. Absolutely. There is the conversation that we are very familiar with the democratic deficit and the imperfections of this democratic foundation of the European lawmaking. At the same time, even though I really emphasize the role of the Commission, we also have the involvement of the Council and through that the national governments and the role of the Parliament. Where the legislation comes from the Commission and then goes through these more democratic institutions. So in many ways, it is not detached from the democratic processes, but it's more indirect in its relationship to voters. The Commission is more aware of this, I would say, and, for instance, tries to listen to a lot of stakeholders as part of its impact assessment process. That is part of every preparation of legislation. And I think that is a very important part of the preparations. And for instance, compared to the United States, if you look at the lobbying, the stakeholders trying to influence the legislation, there's a lot of research showing that in the EU, unlike in the United States, it is not just the corporations that have access to the Commission. a lot of the citizen groups, the NGOs, also have access to the legislative process, are also being heard. And the outcome is more balanced in reflecting the views of these different stakeholders. So that might give some comfort and some reassurance that these democratic sort of foundations are being channeled into the legislative rulemaking also through these hearings and consultations and impact assessment. But in that sense, I think if there's a democratic concern, there is certainly a democratic concern expressed outside of the EU, where they say, what about an American consumer or a farmer in Kenya that is being affected by these rules? And how are they being heard? And how can they shape the rules that ultimately affect them? So I think that is a harder question to answer, but still something that I also take on in the book, and goes back to our earlier discussion, how in many ways the EU may be offsetting some of the democratic deficiencies in many other countries where they regulatory process may not be producing the kind of regulatory framework that necessarily fully corresponds to the democratic preferences in those countries as well.
Professor Bradford, thank you so much for this very interesting conversation. Thank you for explaining to us what the Brussels effect is and what effects it has as well. Thank you.
That was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.